Today, the Upfield line provides an important transport link between Melbourne CBD and the northern suburbs, but 35 years ago it looked like the line may not live to see the 21st century. Today we'll have a look at the plans to replace or close the Upfield line in the 1980s and 90s, how the line was saved, and what has occurred since. The Upfield line began as a railway from North Melbourne to Coburg in 1884. 5 years later, the line was extended to Somerton, with the line duplicated as far as Coburg by 1891. Despite this, in 1903, the line beyond Coburg was closed to all traffic. 3 years later, in 1906, the line to Fawkner was reopened, but it was only used for funeral trains, thanks to the opening of Fawkner Cemetery. 9 years later, the line began seeing regular traffic again, and it was electrified in 1920. The Fawkner to Somerton section has had a much rockier history, however. Closed for a quarter of a century after 1903, it once again saw services from 1928 provided by AEC Rail Motors. This only lasted until 1956, however, when the line was once again closed. 3 years later, the line from Upfield to Somerton was reopened, and shortly after, the line from Fawkner was reopened and electrified. This was alongside duplication to Fawkner. But around this time, the Upfield line began to fall into neglect. September 1958 saw the end of Sunday service after 6 p.m. 13 years later, all Sunday service was withdrawn, with railway tickets accepted on the Route 19 tram to North Coburg, and a bus shuttle provided from there to Upfield. However, further cuts were planned for the Upfield line. In 1980, the Loney Report recommended closing the Upfield line, alongside many others in Melbourne and Victoria. This was understandably very controversial, and following the election of a Labor government in 1982, politically infeasible. The same government also came with plans for the rail network. The new government began investigating conversion of underutilised suburban branches to light rail. This was in effect just glorified tram lines that had their own dedicated right-of-way for part of the route. Initially, the government planned to convert the Port Melbourne and St Kilda lines to light rail. Announced in 1982, detail on the plan was not released until 1985. The project would include massive changes to infrastructure. The St Kilda and Port Melbourne lines were closed in July and October of 1987 respectively, and reopened in November and December. These lines gave Melbourne and the Met some experience with light rail. While light rail on these lines enabled substantial cost savings, they also had some consequences for passengers that continued to this day. For example, disabled passengers were unable to take the trams on the route until low-floor trams were introduced some 15 years later, and to this day some services on Route 109 are operated by high-floor trams. Although the light rail projects enabled higher frequency on the routes, with trams running substantially more frequently than trains, capacity on the corridor was still substantially reduced, as even an E-class tram today carries less than a fifth of the people that can fit in, for example, an Extrapolis train. This means that trams are incredibly overcrowded, and even with a higher frequency, have substantially less capacity than a train line. Nevertheless, the Met began investigating options for the future of the Upfield line. 3 options were proposed: a minor or major rail upgrade and a light rail conversion. The Met's preferred option was to replace the line with light rail. This would involve conversion of the rail line between Brunswick Road and Upfield to a light rail line, with track converter to standard gauge and power converted from 1500 to 600 volt direct current. Alongside modifications to the 10 existing stations to accommodate trams, there will be 5 new light rail stops constructed, similar to the additional stops constructed along the Port Melbourne and St Kilda tram lines. Trams would have run into the city along the existing route between Park Street and Flinders Street Station on the Route 19. Many new light rail vehicles would be purchased, which would have been the first trams in Melbourne to even be partially low floor. They would have run at 2.5 minute intervals in the peak and 5 minutes in the off-peak, compared to intervals of up to 30 minutes for the existing train service. This would have required at least 40 light rail vehicles. The rail line between North Melbourne and Brunswick Road would have been abandoned and replaced with a bus service, with part of the corridor to be reused for the Weston Bypass Freeway, eventually known as CityLink. A short track connection along Park Street would have been required to link to Royal Parade. Finally, a shuttle bus would be provided between Brunswick Road and Bell Street along Sydney Road, which was later replaced with a shuttle tram after discontent from locals and shop owners. A short connection to Brunswick Tram Depot, as well as an upgrade to it, would have been required. Ultimately, it was estimated this would require around $65 million to construct, compared to at least $70 million for a train upgrade. However, it's worth noting this did include $25 million in savings from reusing the line for the Western Bypass project, meaning it could have ended up costing almost $20 million more than a train upgrade. However, the project to replace the line with a light rail came into a lot of problems. There were many protests organised by locals, councils and the Public Transport Users Association. Issues with the project included trams being inaccessible, the loss of the rail line to North Melbourne and the replacement of it with a tollway, the closure of the Sydney Road tram line and safety concerns over replacement of hand and boom gates on the line with just traffic lights. Along with this, the study recommended that much of the heritage rail infrastructure like buildings and signal boxes be retained, given its significance as in many cases this technology was no longer used anywhere else. This would increase the cost of the light rail project. In the end, the government just dropped it, as it would have been enormously damaging politically, and by this point Victoria had also entered a deep recession. However, when the Kennett government came to power in a landslide in 1992, suddenly closure or replacement of the railway was back on the table. The new government proposed closures of a large portion of the metropolitan and regional railway networks. Although most closures were cancelled, 5 regional lines ended up being cut. The Upfield line was originally planned to be closed in April 1993, however this did not occur. Instead, the government announced it would keep the line at least in the short term, while assessments were made as to its future. 2 years later, in April 1995, it was announced that the line would be retained and upgraded instead of being closed, and the future of the Upfield line was finally secured. The upgrade of the line would include several elements. Power signalling would be extended from Macaulay to Upfield, replacing the ancient semaphore signalling that was now obsolete almost everywhere else. CityLink would be constructed above the line instead of along its right-of-way, enabling the rail and road to coexist. The many level crossings along the line would be upgraded or closed, with all hand gates replaced by boom gates and level crossings closed at Barclay Street, Tinning Street and Shorts Road. Along with this, the line would be duplicated from Fawkner to Gowrie, with Fawkner Station receiving a second platform. Gowrie's existing second platform, used only for stabling a handful of terminating trains, would be connected through to the main line at the Upfield end, and Coburg Station would receive a second platform in the place of the old goods yard. Works were completed throughout 1997 and 1998, with the line connected to the rest of the system only by means of regular diesel-hauled transfers on the disused line between Upfield and Somerton. Finally, service was restored after 7:30 p.m. and on Sundays, giving the line full service, albeit at low frequency. In 2004, all services were finally extended from 3 to 6 car trains as well. With the Upfield line upgraded, light rail plans were finally put to rest and have never been seriously considered again. Ultimately, in 2014, it was announced that level crossings at Bell Street and Moreland Road would be removed by 2022, with the intermediate Munro and Reynard Street crossings added in 2018. The entire line through Moreland and Coburg was raised and rebuilt as a Skyrail during 2020, with the original ground level right-of-way now used as parkland and a cycle path. And most recently, the government announced as part of the 2022 election that it would extend this Skyrail all the way down to south of Jewel, meaning that the Upfield line will be level crossing 3 throughout Brunswick, Moreland and Coburg. Along with that, the opening of the Metro Tunnel within the next few years will mean that the Upfield line will see substantial service boosts, making it more usable and frequent. Even further in the future, the Upfield line could play a major role in transport in Melbourne's north. In a project often referred to as the Somerton Link, the Upfield line would be duplicated between Gowrie and Upfield, and the disused line from Upfield to Roxburgh Park would be duplicated, electrified and reopened. From there, the line could run through to Craigieburn on existing or new tracks, and then continue out on a newly electrified line to Donnybrook and Wallen. This would have been completely unthinkable in the late 1980s, but may well become a reality over the next decade or so. It would provide access to growing suburbs beyond the end of the wires at Craigieburn, without forcing passengers onto the already overcrowded Craigieburn line. And with the City Loop reconfiguration not too far off as well as potential for further level crossing removals, the Upfield line could see even more trains and become even more used and important, making it one of the best lines in Melbourne. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. See you in the next video sometime soon.